Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our STEM in the City workshop. The STEM in the City workshop is I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Takiwa Smith. I am founder and executive director of Science, Engineering, Mathematics Link Incorporated, also known as SEN Link. And I want to welcome you to our STEM in the City workshop. Our STEM in the City workshop is a program of our Math and Science Career Academy. And the goal of this program is to expose you to earth and environmental science careers. Earth and environmental science are STEM that impacts our everyday lives, but we don't always know that those are scientists working in those fields, and we definitely don't always know what they do. But it's one of these STEM disciplines is multidisciplinary that really impacts our everyday world. Access to clean water, the food we eat, soil, air quality, so many aspects of earth and environmental science that are important to our everyday lives. So it's important that we are not only aware of these fields, but if you are interested in these fields, whether air quality, soil quality, the ocean. If you like seafood like me, you want to make sure the oceans are clean so you can keep getting your crab, shrimp, and other seafood. So these fields impact our everyday lives. So it's important that those of you that are interested in these can learn about them and know that it's a possible career path for you by learning what these scientists do every day, and most importantly, getting a positive role model in that field that you can learn what they do in their journey to becoming a earth or environmental scientist. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our program coordinator, Carlin Pounders, who's going to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Takiwa. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. So today's speaker is Dr. Carita Venable, who is a postdoctoral researcher with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or commonly referred to as the EPA. She earned her PhD from the Howard University Program for Atmospheric Sciences. She is an enthusiastic interdisciplinary environmental scientist who also holds a BS in geology and a master's in environmental science. Dr. Venable's previous work experience includes being a professor and graduate faculty member at Columbus State University and Columbus Technical College within the Earth and Space Sciences and General Studies departments. In addition to her role at the EPA, she's currently serving 2 consecutive terms as commissioner for the Keep Columbus Beautiful Commission for Columbus, Georgia. Dr. Venable has over 18 years of experience in environmental research, educational outreach, teaching, public speaking engagements, and mentorship to stimulate and enhance the next generation of scientists and STEM professionals. So we are going to have a really amazing workshop today. And without further ado, I will pass it over to Dr. Venable.
Well, good morning or afternoon, wherever you are at. I'm so pleased to be here. And thank you so much, Carolyn and Tawika, for inviting me to this session. I'd like to start off first by saying I love my job as an environmental scientist. I have a passion for providing decision support tools and mechanisms to help improve our environment. Things dealing with air quality, water quality, and also climate change. So, why should we care about some of these things? I guess to start off, well, where does everything that we love come from? The earth. And so the earth has so many different finite resources that we take for granted on a daily basis to provide those ecological and water quality services that it provides. So, for instance, trees provide carbon dioxide, will suck up carbon dioxide that is an excess from the environment and thus give us oxygen. Not only that, the trees also are primary producers. So, as primary producers, They give us fruit and food that we eat, and also help to regulate our water quality, which is what I'm going to be discussing today. So, currently in my role, just to give a little background about what I'm doing at the EPA as an ORAS postdoctoral researcher, I am an environmental modeler, which takes in available data from anywhere in the globe at any specific time. And I'm trying to utilize that to mimic what is actually happening within an ecosystem. There are several different components to that. We have soil types, we have stream flow data, we have precipitation and temperature data. We also have digital elevation models, which show the terrain of the earth. And with all of these things, the models that I'm working with now are trying to depict two main things. Number one, stream flow quantity. So, how fast are we getting it? Number one. Number two is what is inside of the water? Is it just pure water or is it something else? When we have these contaminants in the water, inclusive of sediment, these particles can contaminate our water supply that we use for all different purposes on a day-to-day basis. So what is the problem? I'm going to do a screen share so that I can walk with you through some initial environmental science things. And while I am trying to get my share together, okay, I think you should see me now. This is just a short little presentation about my glimpse as an environmental scientist and how I got to where I'm at. So we'll start off by saying,
Okay, Dr. Venable, we don't see your presentation, so we just see the screen.
okay, maybe, can you see this now?
No, not yet. We still see the screen where you're in StreamYard,
Okay,
and so
let
we need to
me,
see your.
yes. All right, so let's stop the screen share and I'll share again. Share screen. And I'm going to do the entire screen. All right, can you see this now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to go into presentation mode to see if you can see this now.
Yes, we can see it.
All right, so singing in the rain. So why do I call this singing in the rain? Formerly, as a field scientist during my environmental science and geology programs, I was always outside when it rained. Why? Because that's when we have stream flow that's in excess. So I used to go out and take the stream flow velocity profile and also the depth of stream channels, and looking at how impervious surfaces increase stream flow. So in essence, I had to learn how to sing in the rain and be content in order to get those measurements. So, some things that go into being an environmental scientist, well, are you passionate, right? We tend to love what we do and we're trying to make an impact for the greater good of society. So, where does water come from? Let's start there. Water comes from a lot of different sources, but for the most part, it is controlled by the hydraulic cycle. So we could have water in the form of liquid water. We could also have water in the form of vapor. And we can also have water in the form of ice, like ice particles that are seen in high cirrus clouds, or even snow that is captured at the top of a mountain, or maybe in terms of ice, in terms of ice sheets. Well, there's only about 3% of all the water available on Earth that is fresh water that we can drink. So without water, nothing lives. So that is where my passion comes from. Well, what is exactly driving our water? Well, water is mostly driven by climate. Well, climate is a long term duration of temperature and precipitation, which comes from condensation nuclei from the clouds, which then rains down into our river channels. And then that water then is used for things like agricultural purposes, used for flushing our toilets at our home. It's also used for things like drinking water that we have bottled. I don't know if you can still see my camera or not, but I was just showing a picture of a water bottle. I'll get back to there. So when we have changes in water, we get changes in growth of the primary producers. So why do we care about this? Well, that means that in essence, whatever is in the water comes back down, then is released back into the food that we eat, which then gets into our body, which also controls our health. So if we have impurities that exist within our daily weather, which creates our climate, for instance, disturbances like wildfires, which produce smoke, additionally, like volcanic eruptions, which produce smoke plumes as well, or burning of fossil fuels, which changes the system from just looking at water particles, but now we're looking at mixed particles which contain other contaminants. So, for example, how do we get acid rain? Acid rain comes from uh, particles that either can be in the size of small droplets that are in the vapor, gas phase, or either a liquid phase. Sometimes they can also be even whole grain sizes that are very, very microscopic. These then coagulate with water, which is then condensed into making our clouds. So then, whatever was in the clouds also can change the fluctuations, or what we like to call precipitation variability, which is shown in this picture on the right. These two pictures from the center and the right were actually taken from a study abroad that I was a part of in Ethiopia. People who do not have urbanized infrastructure like drinking water supply rely heavily on daily precipitation inputs and changes in climate in order to cultivate harvests and to obtain drinking water. But large fluctuations in precipitation, like droughts and floods, can be extremely detrimental to the livelihood of these crops, to the livelihood of the people who are supported by these crops, and also can change drastically the landscape. So, environmental science is a whole lot of things. It's not just air quality or water quality. It is a mishmash of so many things. So I like to tell people, in terms of my background, I have experience with ecology, chemistry, atmospheric science, geology, engineering, and economics in order to provide a suite of information to help sustain environmental processes and to keep ecosystems healthy. So, what can I do with this? Well, there's so many things that we can do with environmental science, right? We can look at different phenomenons that happen over time. We can look at how these changes impact endangered populations. We can physically go out and do modeling. We can also do um, numerical modeling, which is done through some sort of computer software or programming language. We can also go out and collect specimens and derive experiments. And all of this is an effort to gain knowledge, right? To help make sure that populations of species, including ourselves, are treated fair and just, and that they are provided the resources that are necessary to sustain. Also, we want to know things like, well, how does land transformation or degradation of these land types alter changes in water, in climate, and our food? And are there different migration patterns that are associated with fathom or scarcity in resources? So, all of these things help solve particular problems which are unique for each ecosystem. So, a lot of things that I've done, always look at atmospheric science or either hydrology in some context. So, all research is important, right? But it is relevant to an area or a particular key in trying to understand what processes are important in a particular area. This particular slide over here to the right that shows the precipitation, shows the hydraulic cycle in blue, where we have precipitation, which is the fallout of excess of water from the clouds. We also have evapotranspiration, which where gas phase form of water is then expanded out. And then those gas particles then are coalesced together or stick together in order to make these clouds. And then we get some sort of particles that then tag along water vapor or particulates in the atmosphere, which then increase or suppress precipitation formation. So later on in our discussion today, I'm actually going to talk about a hands-on lab that I've created to kind of mimic these things in terms of the different states of water, and also what happens to the water when it gets into our soil and infiltration rates. So, one of the things that I've learned that is so important with environmental science is that we can't predict always what's going to happen. So, we just have to learn just to go with it, right? So, we have a bunch of experimental designs that are constructed by methods and procedures that we do. In this particular experiment, I was looking at stream flow and water chemistry in relation to stream flow discharge measurements that I obtained at a culvert that was outside of my college. So every time it rained outside, I was out here taking these cross sectional area measurements at each one of these increments across the shoreline, and then was able to create a flow discharge analysis, which basically is nothing but how much water is running in a particular distance over time, which is quantified by a volume. So I look at that volume of water, and then that discharge is divided by the time that it takes to pass through a particular increment in space. These little containers here actually were collecting water samples, which we then took back to the lab and analyzed using these little cuvettes, which take in light and photo analyze what is in the water. So we were looking at nitrogen and phosphate. Nitrogen and phosphorus are things that are found in the system in excess at times due to contaminants like agricultural runoff, and also um, air quality contaminants that have been dispersed out from the wind and then either have coalesced with water to then fall out from those rain droplets, or they just settle and fall out. Which brings me to my next point: what goes up must go down. So, what makes everything go down? Gravity. So, essentially, gravity is another mechanism that helps us to understand, to get water to come back to the ground for where we can obtain it. So, after we've gotten results, so what am I doing now? These are images that come from uh different catchments. So these border orange lines are catchments within Colorado, which they deem as HUP 12. That is just a reference to a watershed boundary area. And then we see that there are these little blue lines here that are in different shades showing actual stream flow velocity profiles for each one of these little segments within the catchment. This particular area of interest is looking at an area that was disturbed from a wildfire. So the biomass was in all of these areas, and then now it had gotten burned in 2002 in Colorado, and now I'm making a model to actually mimic what happens to those stream flow channels in terms of nutrients and also discharge for each one of those particular dots that you see in question. As we talked about before, this is from another research project. um, I can look at differences spatially of the amount of precipitation that I'm getting. So in this case here, the differences or comparisons between 50-year and 10-year precipitation, where there's higher blue colors, you'll notice that that's an increase of precipitation, and the more red are the lack of precipitation that is occurring within the Philippines. Well, information like this is important to understand future trends that are occurring for our water budget, because the amount of water we have in a system um, keeps circulating, but it doesn't change. So it's important that we monitor these differences as it may impact local consumption availability of water. Um, so, three questions every scientist says, what or where am I going to study? And where's the data that I'm going to be using? And who's going to fund my research? And we always have to disseminate, well, what part are we doing right now, or what role are we playing in order to execute our science? Another part that's important to this is, well, how do we get this out to the people? Because that is also critical. So, what am I currently doing about the problem? I've kind of talked about this already. This is actually a video of the landscape that I'm looking at. This is the digital elevation model for the Hayman fire. And notice that there's an area that's in dark blue. That is the main channel of the catchment, and places of higher elevation are shown in red. So from high to low goes the flow, and hence the water. So where you see these little arrows at is also a mimicking of the model of the flow of water throughout all of these channels. So terrain also mitigates water or controls water flow. So what else causes changes to water dynamics? So we've talked about changes in climate. That could be things in terms of temperature. That could be in terms of pressure gradients, like a lot of wind. So when we have a high and low pressure system near each other, we get a lot of wind, and wind can cause erosion and also push water as well. What about land management practices? So things like cropping or creating urbanized city centers, which have a lot of impervious surfaces. They don't allow infiltration of water to seep back into the ground. So that thus causes hydraulic stress. What about pumping out water, right? We use water for all different types of products that we develop on a day-to-day basis. And so this can also cause additional stress. So something else too, though, to think about is what we as humans are doing, and also what natural disturbances are also doing to change the water quantity and quality. So this raises a need for us to figure out mitigation adaptations for localized places, to understand how we can improve or offset some of these things. Um, Another thing is green infrastructure. So just the actual planting of crops or trees um, around stream channels can also help protect those hydraulic zones, even from the aspect of looking at different types of trees, because they all have different infiltration rates or evapotranspiration capabilities. So those differences also can cause changes. What about things like detention ponds, or also like I recently seen in Las Vegas with Lake Mead? They have washes, which actually help to reconnect all of the impervious surface runoff um, that occurs, and then it redirects all that water back into the catchment, or in this case, Lake Mead or the Hoover Dam, reservoir. Uh, Also, these type of studies help to allow us to make decision support tools. So we can't just go out and burn a whole forest, or we can't just plant 100 trees without understanding what those impacts are going to be. So using models like this one, which is VELMA, of which stands for Visualizing Ecosystem Land Management and Assessment, allows us to physically see what's happening to soils below ground and on the surface, and also reservoirs like here, seen here. This is actually the Chessman Reservoir, which provides drinking water for Denver and Colorado Springs. So, what happens if the water is contaminated? What are the costs associated with too much erosion from increases amounts of water? Um, all of these questions can be asked with a model. So, that is why I do environmental modeling. I can assess in my model with a small change in one parameter what it would be like if if there was no change in a forest over time, and the hydraulic flow dynamics, or what happens when there is an abundance of water, or in the system. How does that change the concentrations of the nutrients within the system? So, all of this is important because we need water on a day-to-day basis. So, my driving question for part of my research right now is, well, what is the response of stream flow quantity and nutrient loading before and after wildfire disturbances? As you know, wildfires continually to be on the rise. And most recently, last year, we had one of the most horrific fire seasons, which took away a lot of biomass. This picture on the right, um, which is given from remotely sensed data from satellites, takes into account the change in biomass between the fire. So I'm looking at the year now post fire between 2010 and 15, and we can still see a burn scar which exists from the fire 20 years later. So, what is the response then of stream flow quantity and nutrient loading before and after the wildfire disturbance? So, in my job now, I am actually writing up a publication about this, and getting ready to submit it for review to go into a journal. And my other side of my job is making sure that I communicate this information out to the public. So, this is showing a change between those, just going through that. This is that same area that we just looked at on the video that was showing with that outlined area. This is a particular water catchment in the middle of the area that was burned. Um, so biomass, let's get to that somewhere else. I'll talk about biomass again in a moment when I get to the hands-on portion. So my second project that I'm doing as an environmental modeler is that I am mimicking what deposition is occurring in a river system if if sediment was input into any river in the country. So what this actually is a snapshot from my Fortran code, where all of these things on the left-hand side are variables that I have developed within the system. And we don't want that to restart. All right. And so this then allows for us to then say, depending upon whatever type of particle it is, each particle has a mass, which means that it also has a density, and it also houses a concentration. So with this, at each time interval step, it is calculating the difference of mass that is traveling over time and where it should be depositing. Each one of these particles here shows a different type of particle that has been deposited into a river at, let's say, time 0, at the beginning of a river segment, and then over time these things deposit out. And I'm actually calculating here what these things look like in each interval. All right. This is actually a link to something that my job is providing of actual water quality stream flow analysis that's present. So I'll finish up this part of the presentation to say some things I wish I knew when I was going to school or going to college. So anybody can be a subject matter expert and can review a paper. So what does that mean? Um, Typically, we publish content in order for it to be accepted as practice for the best practices within the science. So we have to get some subject matter expertise in order to review these papers, and we like to publish them. So all research is important, no matter the size or scope. And if we had more funding, we would do more. But we should also try to make sure we know the needs of a society. So know who your stakeholders are, or how this might impact them, to better give them decision support tools that would be adequate. And being a scientist, you constantly are evolving yourself. So one thing that I always say is that units are units and they just change. We just have to know how to best change them. So we need to be able to adapt in order to survive in terms of our careers. And as technology increases, we also should strive for that as well, because those advancements allow us to answer other fundamental things in terms of forecasting and prediction. So data is everywhere. We could do we could do data collection at our homes. We could get it from the internet. We could use all different types of metrics in order to quantify what we're looking at. We just need to know how to use it. And where I have here that says data science may be the solution, well, what if I told you that we could have a calculator that just said, hey, these are the environmental parameters that we're looking at, and I want to know what comes out on the other side. That's essentially what data science allows us to do. It allows us to have environmental calculators for any point, space, and time. So what if I didn't have to keep doing that problem over and over again, or do the math out? Computer science is a great avenue in order to deal with that repetition. So I will get out of this and stop screen sharing and go to the other part of the presentation. All right. So, what is something that you could do at home to actually show the hydraulic cycle on a small scale? First of all, what you're going to need are some 16-ounce cups, well, 8-ounce cups, excuse me. I've actually used 8 of them at a time in order to show my system of interest. So what I've done is I've actually used some water as well. I've measured it out to be a half a cup of water, where with some food color, I have now said that this was the starting point for my blue water. So basically, the blue food coloring is just to show um, pure water. All right, so we'll need that. So a half a cup of water, and I just put blue food coloring in here. You'll also need a piece of celery top. Um, with basically the leaves that are present. And you also can use like a small piece of carrot as well. And then for your sand or soil mixture, you can either use, so I've done 2-part presentation. Number one was using old coffee grounds. So I'll show the pictures of that. And also, I've used some with sand. So I'll show that. All right. So, in the first experiment with the saturated coffee grounds, I take a half a cup of coffee grounds and I put it into 1 cup. Then I split it in half as even as I can. So I actually have a cup here that I've placed a line here at the top for what my initial level was. And then I took out half of the coffee grounds or sand and I put it into the other cup. All right, so what are we doing? All right, so number one, to mimic where water is coming from, this is just pure water. And so all the water that we have in the system was initially up to this line. In my second cup, I have put some food coloring that is of opposite color. I would say that like a primary color. So yellow or red would be good if you have that. Inside of a packed container of soil or sand. And then in another one, I just used like a measuring cup in order to pack down the soil. You can use like a spoon scooper as well. And then in another cup, I have put the rest of the coffee grounds or sand. And I've also used a piece of celery in each. So, what are we showing here? So, let's go in order first. Number one, matter cannot be created or destroyed. The water that I have here, oh, and in each cup they are doubled. Okay, so notice there's a double cup in each. So the amount of water that we have in the system is the amount of water that we have in the system. And matter cannot be created nor destroyed. It just changes form. So blue represents the purity of that. Well, if I were to then say that in terms of the hydraulic cycle, I've been doing experiments since last night, and actually for a whole week now, which I'll show you the other one in a second, where I have been placing in the celery here, and notice that I put it in the cup with the water that has been dyed blue, and the celery now has transpired up from the bottom up to the top of the leaves, the blue food coloring. So this is to mimic the evapotranspiration that occurs with biomass in terms of the hydraulic cycle. I've also done this here with a carrot. And no, the carrot was higher than the water. So if we look up here towards the top, notice that from the bottom where it was sitting at, that these capillaries with inside of here have been sucking up all of the water that it can and brought it up here to the top of the carrot. So that is showing evapotranspiration. All right, that's number one. So then those gases then rise up to the atmosphere and help create clouds. So number one, biomass helps to regulate water. Also want to note that I was able to put these pieces of celery in a well sunlit area so that it wouldn't wilt for growing purposes, because as we know, we don't just need water, we also need sunlight. Now, my coffee grounds were previously saturated. So the saturation and acidity from the coffee grounds actually killed my celery. So in this particular container, I had some food color dye as well. But notice in each one of my cups, I also have used a thumbtack at the bottom of the inside cup. So what is that to show? So the water from the system, if this was like an aquifer, and I put a hole in the bottom, then the water would be infiltrating down to the storage tank where all the water is housed. This will definitely take time, but remember, this is gravity that is acting on this. Now, if I were to sit this cup back in here, the system is at equilibrium and no water is being transpired out. All right, so that's just showing that again, that gravity is working on that in order to take the water out the system. Let's use another example of something else that could take water out the system, right? I have some straws that are different colors that are mimicking, let's say, industry. One is for household consumption. One is for impervious surfaces. If I were to take a sip out of each one of these, it will take away the water that is in the system, right? So that says that it leaves less water in the system. Now, for each one of these other cups, now remember, these were my saturated coffee grounds. So there was a lot of water already in the system, and I poured some of this blue water in here. This particular one that had no biomass has been infiltrating liquid down from this level that it was at first, but it was very packed, so it couldn't get through very fast. So it's taken about 8 days in order to go through. Notice though that I have this darker green color that's in here from the combination of the blue and the green dye that was used. In this particular container, the same amount of water was placed inside. There is a hole below, but none of the water really seeped down into the bottom. The reason why is that the biomass was here actually taking up some of the water. But because of the acidity and overlog of water, we ended up with a dead celery plant. So, what did I want to try to do is to use something else that was not saturated, like sand. So, I did another experiment that started yesterday that I had the sand in. Oh, before I get to that part, this is showing me dipping in the celery from last week that has been imported into blue. Notice the blue that's inside of the stem. And then I've just saturated it in this red to now make some rainbow celery. So you can actually regrow this back in some water. And in this particular container that I've used today now with the sand, I've also went through and I've put the blue water that was in here. I have a column of sand that a hole has been placed in, and notice that there has been some infiltration, but the sand has soaked up a lot of it, and only a little bit is left back in the groundwater recharge. But then in this particular one that I didn't pack at all, there is a lot more liquid. We even see the liquid still coming out of this container from today. So this has not been overly saturated yet. It is constantly infiltrating. So the ground type or soil types that we have present also change or alter our groundwater recharge. So you can make rainbow celery as well. This one is a mixture of the red dye and blue dye to make this purple color that's present. So that is an example of the hydraulic cycle in a nutshell. And I will stop to take any questions.
Okay. All right. That was so great, Dr. Venable. Carlin is having a little internet trouble, of course, right?
Of
So I
course.
am going to ask questions.
Okay.
Um, and if anyone will put it in the any questions in the chat, you can go ahead and do that. And so um, that was such a great presentation, and we can really tell how you opened and it said you love your job, that you're really passionate about your work. And we really hope that's one of the reasons we have these type of events for youth, right? Because we want to have them to meet somebody that is doing a job that they love, and they can realize, okay, you can actually have a job that you love, doing something that you enjoy, that you're really really good at, right? Because we aren't always taught that, right? We taught to go to college, get a job, make money, pay bills, right? But
Right.
not knowing that work could be fun and you can be passionate about it. So thank you for sharing your passion about your work. I could hear all within your presentation. And so I have a few questions. The first question that I thought to ask is, how can youth recognize, like, if the environmental science is for them? Like, or how can they notice that they're interested in that? Like, what are some things that they could see, notice, or things that they're not even paying attention to that they may do on a regular basis that can make them think, oh, I may be interested in environmental science?
If you are good at observing patterns or just a good observationalist, right? That is key number one in being a great scientist, to be able to observe and record. Um, if you love the environment or like to see the changes that occur, or you have questions as to, well, why does that happen the way that it happens? Um, you definitely probably have a good knack for doing environmental science. And normally, when you're out there in the field, or if you go camping, or if you take, rides and walks in nature on a frequent, you mostly are infatuated with environmental science. I will say that. So those are some keys.
Okay. In your presentation, you said you traveled to Ethiopia for your work. So, what was the most surprising thing that you discovered while doing your research overseas? And have you traveled anywhere else abroad to do your work?
So, on the second part of the question, I mostly have been dealing with things in states. Um, I loved Ethiopia so much that when I had a second chance to go, I went again. um, when I went to Ethiopia, I think that one of the most fascinating things for me was how diverse the whole country is. So if you go from a mountainous terrain like Choke Mountain, how the people were living there versus when you go closer to, let's say, the Nile River Valley, how those people were living. So farming techniques were different. Um, things dealing with water mitigation or soil erosion were different because of the amount of water that was being input into the system. And basically, there was a complete difference in the microclimates. So the mountains themselves, they provided their own climate, and then you get down to the lower river valley, and then there is another, microclimate that's there. So people were having to deal with each one of those things, and I guess the community farmers were so impacted by it that they wanted to know more about how to deal with these fluctuations that occurred to keep their continuing practices on, because this is their livelihood. So climate directly impacted their day to day processes.
Okay, that's so great. I love Ethiopian food, and I never really even thought about, um, in one country, right? How much diversity in the terrain. Like, yeah, it amazing. So I can be as imagine as environmental science. That was a perfect, like, heaven for you to study to study all of diversity of terrains and climates. Um, and what are some tips that you have for people that want to find mentors in environmental scientists and getting to know them so they can kind of learn.
Um,
Um,
I would say number one, if you see somebody, say something, right? Get their contact information, send them an email. They might not reply, immediately, but it will come in the pipeline. And most people are really avid to help. If you find someone who is interested in similar science, or you just want to find out about what they do, you can ask to shadow them at work, even online. A lot of work is being done online, right? So I can actually show people what I'm doing by doing a screen share as well. So there are opportunities for summer camps, right, that you can go to and get a little exposure as to if you like this or not before deciding to go to college in it. But yeah, email us, LinkedIn, use social media. Some of us are on there too, using these platforms, but most of us are willing to help and assist.
okay. And so, do you have any parting words of wisdom to share with future environmental scientists?
It all matters, and so do you. And so everybody has a unique contribution that they can make to the scientific society. A lot of times, where you come from shapes the problems that you are trying to explore and make change in. So, one, if you see a problem, figure out a solution. If you figure out a solution, figure out how to employ it so that society can benefit. And just remember to stay passionate and check your units.
Thank you so much. I learned so much about the hydraulic cycle. Is that what it is?
Yes.
Okay. I'm a chemical engineer by training, so that biology is kind of like remembering all those terms. But I just know that you have inspired somebody to think about the world around them and the water, right? And how it impacts us, Um, and hopefully want to do the work to change that so we continue to have access to clean water that impacts our food systems and so many other things that impact our quality of life. So thank you so much for giving up your time. Those of you that have joined live or via YouTube, there is a link for our evaluation survey in the chat. So please take a few moments to fill that out. Your feedback is really, really important. So we not only can collect your feedback to learn how you like these Denison City Cafes, but also so we can continue to get funding to continue to bring these to you. So we hope that you learn so much. We hope that if you are interested in anything about water, that you consider studying hydrology. And thank you again, Dr. Venable, for giving us your time, sharing your passion with us, and giving kids an example of a career path that they can pursue.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a
You're
pleasure.
welcome. All right. And everyone, have a great rest of your day. And we will see you at our next event, which we are just doing Hour of Code for Computer Science Education Week. So you can follow us on social media um, to learn more about our upcoming programs. Bye.